Welcome to today's meeting of the LaRouche Organization's Manhattan Project for Saturday, January 27th. Now, yesterday was the 30th anniversary of the release of Lyndon LaRouche from jail back in 1994, and was an auspicious day in the sense that an important blow was struck that day for universal justice, justice that still eludes us on the question of Lyndon LaRouche's exoneration, but nonetheless, which the world got to see exhibited in a very proud way yesterday. The ruling by the International Court of Justice that affirmed the validity of the petition brought by the nation of South Africa, which was arguing that the nation of Israel is in violation of the 1948 Genocide Convention in its military campaign in Gaza, is viewed as an historic decision. Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammad Shtayyeh said that, quote, Africa's position is an important step, South Africa's position, because it puts Israel in the defendant's seat. And this is the first time Israel is being accused of something like this at the International Court of Justice. South African Foreign Minister Pandor explained her response to the ruling.
Decisively. I believe that in exercising the order, there would have to be a ceasefire. Without it, the order doesn't actually work. I would have wanted a ceasefire. I don't think it's a matter of South Africa and Israel here. The real issue, all your questions are about Israel, but the real issue is the people of Palestine who are being killed every day. The people of Palestine who are sleeping in the cold. The people of Palestine who are denied food, water, and energy. That is the critical issue that all of us should focus upon. The people of Palestine have suffered harm for many, many decades. I don't believe it will end today or tomorrow. But what we've done is a very clear signal has been sent by the court. And it's now a test for the government and people of Israel as to whether they will act in a manner that says all of us must respect international law. If Israel acts in accord with it, I think the implications are for a future hopeful world. Should it not, then essentially we are opening up room for all abusers in many conflicts throughout the world. And I think we'll be setting a terrible, terrible precedent. So what we should do, what all of us should do, is call on Israel to act in terms of the decision.
Now, South Africans' actions reflect the new colonialism is over world orientation that's being exemplified by what you can call the BRICS Plus alliance. That is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the other nations that have recently joined. But there's also worldwide forces for peace through development, which are now not only mobilizing and recognizing that there's a deeper matter that has to be confronted, they're actively doing it. And this decision has already sparked some action, including in the United States. To talk to us a little bit about that, we have Stuart Battle, who is with the LaRouche Organization. He's going to give us a battle report on something that just happened. So, Stuart, please go right ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're very clear.
Good. Okay. So I'm speaking to you from Detroit, Michigan area today. And so we learned of a town hall meeting with one of the local congressmen that happened this morning. He, as people might know, there's a very large population in the Michigan area of an Arabic community. It has had massive support, including the Detroit City Council passing a call for a ceasefire in Israel-Palestine, for other cities like Dearborn, and there's a few others, that this congressman has not done so thus far. And he happens to be the, I believe, the largest, whatever you call it, segment of actual metropolitan Detroit of anyone in the House. So he is definitely going against the grain. His constituents know it, and so there was quite a significant show out of his constituents today at his town hall. So um, anyways, to just give a kind of a flavor of it, it was explosive. There was a small rally of people who were assembling outside of the community center that had speakers and signs and were calling for a ceasefire, demanding the congressman call for a ceasefire. And then inside, it was probably the case, became clear that probably 80 to 90% of the people in the town hall, which maybe ended up being about 80 or so, maybe a little bit more cumulatively, that were in favor of a ceasefire and were there to have their voice be heard, which was very significant. I've gone to many of these town hall meetings over the years, and usually they're dominated by somewhat petty discussions, or people have their little local issues, or they're upset that there is a stop sign missing, on their street corner. This time, not only was that not the case, but the two or three people that did raise, very local issues were almost shouted down by the majority of the people that were there. They said, "Will you hurry up? We want to talk about the genocide taking place in the world with our name on it." So anyway, so this meeting was taken over by those of us, demanding that he take action to stop the U.S. support for Israel committing a genocide in Gaza. And what was interesting was that I think it was more coherent, more determined and passionate, and also calm but serious. There was some, obviously very emotional activity, but many of the questions were very calm and composed and extremely well put, far better spoken than the congressman himself. His name was Shri Tanadar. He's a freshman congressman, immigrant from India. Unfortunately, hasn't maintained the vision of what it means to be a minority in the world, and has taken the stance of the war faction and the complete defense of so-called democracy and against so-called terrorism. But the questions tended to be very serious and composed, and he was doing dancing around every question, avoiding taking it directly on and giving a direct answer about what was an overwhelming request for him to change his stance. And this included a question from a very young woman, which was exceptionally clear on the role of the ICJ ruling yesterday on South Africa's case of genocide. She even cited which article of the Genocide Convention was ruled by the court. Extremely coherent, extremely clear. And so after this went on enough times, and like I said, there was far, far more people there who were interested in that very particular question than anything else. And he kept punting, he kept evading. Then the room just started popping with people that would say, "Oh, that's a lie," or, "Well, why don't you talk about what she actually asked," or whatever. And so he was increasingly caged in from being able to dance around the questions. And at a certain point, he lost total control of the room, and people just kept peppering him with his dishonesty, essentially, is what it was. And then at a certain point, the room stood up and started chanting for a ceasefire. The crowd from outside in the rally came in and joined that process, and he totally lost control. He, after 2 or 3 minutes of this, he kind of sheepishly, kind of stumbled into the middle of the room to pretend like he was grateful that people showed up and he was listening to their opinions, and this kind of, nonsense, this kind of liberal nonsense. Didn't work, of course. And at a certain point, there was a young, probably 4-year-old child that walked up to him and wanted to say something or shake his hand or something. And so he bent down and looked extremely relieved that there was a young child who finally was going to give him some love and appreciation. or something. It wasn't clear. But anyways, after a couple of seconds, his mother, the child's mother, jumped up and said, "Excuse me, this is a Palestinian boy, and the only reason he came up to talk to you is because he wants you to call for a ceasefire." And the congressman jumped back and looked ashamed and further sheepish. Anyways, he eventually had to leave out the back door because he had nothing to say. So anyways, I think it's kind of hard to do it justice. I think you guys might have a video of part of this, but it certainly is a changed environment in the United States. And I think this is a question that, despite what they try to do, they cannot sweep it under the rug or ignore the very real concerns in the American public.
I think we have a few seconds of a video that we can show. So, Jose, if we have that.
Ceasefire now! 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 Ceasefire now!
Okay, so that's your elected representatives at work, apparently. Any further comment you want to make about that performance, Stuart?
Well, as you can probably notice, he was hoping to show up to an event that he could give people a lecture and tell them how to think, and I think he got the opposite handed back to him. So, which is the proper role of political activism in America, I think.
Before you go, Stuart, let me just ask you to say something, because I believe you have been working together with Anastasia and others on this sort of interfaith element also to bring into this whole discussion around the peace process, as well as the idea of the alternative, what we've called the Oasis plan. If you have any comments about either of those things.
Yeah, sure. I think that the point is that, and I spoke to a number of people after the event, after the congressman left and the event kind of wound down. And I think the point that we want to make is that this is not an Israel problem, and you don't want to just pin everything on Israel, which is what a lot of people lean into doing, which is to blame this congressman for being bought out by the Israeli lobby. That may be true, and there certainly is a problem with that. But I think the important point that we have to bring to this discussion is that it's actually a problem of British imperial or Anglo-American thinking, geopolitical thinking, that is really what the disease is, because this would never be allowed to occur if it wasn't for a diseased thinking which allows for these kinds of geopolitical games to be played with American support or with NATO support or whatever it is. And so while we should be critical of the policy in particular in Israel, Gaza, as I was speaking to one gentleman who is actually somewhat of a prominent person who knows the congressman, if you look at the case of Ukraine, it's the exact same policy. So you have two countries, but the identical scenario of the US and British policy being to fuel a conflict with weapons, with political support, and oppose the ending of a violence and the promotion of a peace policy. And that's really the question which I think we have to find a way to reach across wherever people are coming from, whether it's partisanship, whether it's even national viewpoint, whether you come from Israel or you come from the US, or whether you come from a different region which has a different take, a different standpoint on the violence, on how the origination of this violence or this particular wrong that was done or whatever, but instead to recognize that there is a universality that you have to start from as a basis to solve the problem, is the universality of mankind, and that there is, starting from there is a basis to resolve any dispute, as long as you give up this geopolitical and imperial thinking, which precludes ever being a solution on the basis of, having the interest of all parties, combined, essentially. So I think that's what I was trying to bring to it, and I think that's what the interfaith community excels at, because there is you can start from that understanding that there is a oneness of mankind that you can draw upon to actually think through how to solve these problems.
Well, thank you very much, Stuart. I'm glad we were able to open today's broadcast with this, because this is exactly what we're going to be asking people to do at the end of it. So by demonstrating what it is we want to have done, it's always better. It abbreviates the message. It makes it much more clear. So thank you very, very much for that report. Now, I want to bring in another element, because everybody will remember the Ukrainian conflict, and this week with regard to Ukraine, the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity issued a statement. VIP's memo to Biden: avoid a third world war. And you see there, and I'll read it for those who may not be able to make it out, they offered a kind of clinical analysis. No experience of the failure of policy, this meaning Anglo-American policy, can shake belief in its excellence, even though foreign adventures have drained the treasury and led to imperial decline. So a little later in that statement, the VIP's view is, as they put it forward, simply stated, it is not possible to, quote, win the war against Russia and, quote, avoid World War III. So they try to supply a basic semblance of sanity, but they recognize that for some reason, and in the body of the statement they reference Barbara Tuchman's book of The March of Folly, that there seems to be an addiction on the part of the Anglo-American establishment to mistaken policy, that no matter how luridly wrong that policy is proven to be, it's pursued with redoubled effort every time the mistakes and failures are pointed out. Some years ago, Lyndon LaRouche, who, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, was released from jail after serving a wrongful sentence of 5 years in jail from 1989 to 1994. Lyndon LaRouche commented upon this phenomenon in specific, about how you have continuous policy trends that are wrong, what's wrong with the policymakers, and what's wrong with the population that tolerates them.
The existing policies, the policies associated with the International Monetary Fund, the policies associated with NATO, its present policies, these policies doom civilization, just as a fatal orbit dooms a comet. And the comet is now approaching the sun. The problem is that the people in general begin to recognize that the system doesn't work. They recognize that things are becoming worse. They see no hope of a change. They see no clear alternative. They simply say, well, I guess it's doomed. I guess it's doomed. You have cultural pessimism of the type which was experienced in Germany, for example, in the 1920s, especially after 1923. The cultural pessimism, which was the foundation of which the Nazi movement was based. Deprived of a sense of an alternative and perceiving assured disaster, populations become extremely pessimistic and even self-destructive. They become enraged like madmen out of their own frustration and fears. What is their problem? The problem is that they are clinging to the belief that certain definitions, axioms, and postulates underlying their habitual opinion that these things are true. Now, the reason that they allowed themselves to be swindled into making the change in trends in policy making, which we've seen, say, in Germany since the ousting of Adenauer in 63, and especially since Erhard's ousting in 65. You see, these trends in policy making, always more and more toward neoliberalism, always in that direction, and these kinds of things, has led to disaster. But people believe what? They say, well, this is democracy. They don't say what is true. No longer is truth, in the sense of scientific truth, a question. We have to be governed by popular opinion. What is popular opinion? It's what we perceive to be the trends in opinion which have become popular or hegemonic. And these underlying assumptions, definitions, axioms, and postulates determine the way people think. At least, even if they think differently privately, in their public behavior, in speaking in public, or where their career is at stake on their job, or in government, or in other institutions, they express what they believe to be consistent with current trends in modern public opinion. In other words, the key word to identify the disease which is killing civilization today is the word modernization, or similar words like globalization, or similar words like free trade. Free trade says we don't judge whether a product is true or not, whether it's good. We let public opinion, the market, decide whether the product is good. And then if the product crashes, what happens to the people who hold that public opinion, if they're driving in it? It's not so smart, as we might say. So this idea of you don't have to know the truth. You don't have to speak the truth. Maybe the truth doesn't exist, you say, as Kant said in his Critiques of Pure Reason. The truth doesn't exist. So what's left? There are only certain generally accepted assumptions, and there's public opinion. And as Kant said in the Critique of Practical Reason, public opinion is determined by what? He called it negation of the negation. That the pressure of society and the interaction of people in society upon one another in a negative way induces the population to give up opinions and tendencies which are disapproved, and not merely to submit to the authority of public opinion, but to hold it up to be a substitute for truth as a positive virtue, which is what Kant, in the second part of the Critique of Practical Reason, described as negation of the negation, or the dialectic of practical reason, which is also the same principle on which Sigmund Freud based his doctrine of pessimism, and which is as the foundation of his psychoanalysis. So people become conditioned because they no longer believe in truthfulness as science defines truth by experimental proof of universal principles. They no longer believe in truthfulness as Plato defined it through the mouth of Socrates, as in the Republic. They don't believe in that anymore. They find in public opinion, whose code name is democracy, they find a substitute for truth. And once people accept that, which is an anti-scientific opinion, and you note that the characteristic of the changes in policy, or changes in policy trends over the period of the past 30 years and longer, since the 68ers, has been the trend toward accepting what was the doctrine of the Frankfurt School of Theodor Adorno, Hannah Arendt, Martin Heidegger, and so forth. This doctrine, this existentialist doctrine of that form. And therefore, by denying the search for truth, denying the commitment to act as on truth, even if you as an individual know it to be true and nobody else does at that point, to stick to the truth, to discover the truth, to act according to truth and justice, that has been put aside. It was put aside in favor of the Frankfurt School philosophy, in favor of existentialism, in favor of free trade, in favor of the word democracy, which is a mere empty word, an irresponsible word. I don't take any responsibility for what the consequences of my behavior. I have confidence in democracy. I have confidence in public opinion. I will go with public opinion. I have no moral responsibility except to be accepted and approved of by public opinion. That was the poison. That was the poison that killed us. That was the poisonous feature of the orbit of this comet, which is now headed to the sun.
Now, with that introduction, we're now going to take a look at what has transpired, particularly over the past week to 2 weeks, both with respect to the wars, such as the war in Southwest Asia, the war in Ukraine, etc., as well as the domestic political upheavals that are unraveling the various governments of the Anglosphere. We're going to look at both of these in the context of course, what's happened more broadly in the last couple of generations, but also in the context of the immediate future, the various scenarios for what is supposed to be happening. And so what we're going to do is we have two presenters. Everybody who watches our program is familiar with them. That'll be Harley Schlanger and Mike Robinson from UK Column. I want to say welcome to both of you, and we're going to start with Harley. Harley, you get the floor.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. Good to see you, Mike. As Dennis indicated earlier, the ruling of the International Court of Justice was an important first step. Now, I know many people are disappointed because they say, well, this didn't call for a ceasefire. This didn't immediately condemn Israel. But that's not how the International Court of Justice works. But it also shows that people don't understand what you just heard from Lyndon LaRouche, that there are no such things as individual events or current events. But we have to look at a broader arc of history to understand what's going on and to see the importance of an event, not from the immediate moment it happened, but in the context of a longer flow or a strategic conjuncture. And in dealing with the situation in Gaza and Israel, you're not dealing with something that happened on October 7th or even in 1948. You're talking about something that goes back to British policy, British geopolitical policy, from the last decades of the 19th century through the two world wars of the 20th century, which were a direct consequence of British geopolitics. And then from the period of the death of John F. Kennedy, the murder of Kennedy forward, in which the United States became the chief enforcer of an Anglo-American policy. Now, in that context, when you look at it from that standpoint, what happened in the court ruling yesterday is of extraordinary significance. It's a sharp blow to the greater Israel policy, to the fanatics who support that policy in the Netanyahu government, and to their accomplices in the Anglosphere, particularly in the Biden administration, the United Kingdom, and Germany. In her talk yesterday with the International Peace Coalition, Helga Zepp-LaRouche said this was an enormous first step, a devastating blow to Israel, but also to the US and Germany. And she pointed out that in the previous rulings from the International Court of Justice on Myanmar, on Ukraine, on Syria, quote, the US insisted that the provisional measures of the court are binding and must be fully implemented, unquote. Well, will the US comply with that today? That's the question that we need to be the ones who determine, because if you leave it to Biden, the US will continue to support this arc of British policy. Now, Helga went on to praise South Africa for upholding the morality and the standing of humanity by bringing this case to the International Court of Justice. And she noted that the ruling was welcomed by nations throughout the global South. Now, as I said, this is not enough. It's leaving to us the responsibility to make sure the implications of this are carried out. But I want to start by looking at what the court actually said. And it becomes clear from the language that this was exactly what we just said, an important first step toward the principle of providing true justice to the people of Palestine. The first point they made is that Israel must take all possible measures to prevent acts as outlined in Article 2 of the 1948 Genocide Convention. This entails not killing members of a particular group, in this case Palestinians, not causing physical or psychological harm to members of that group, not inflicting living conditions which are calculated to bring about the end of the existence of a people, and not carrying out actions designed to prevent births within that group of people. In other words, it's an anti-genocide ruling. The second point, Israel, keep the poster up there, Israel must ensure its military does not carry out any of the above actions. In other words, no killing, no physical harm, and so on. 3, Israel must prevent and punish the direct and public incitement to commit genocide in relation to members of the Palestinian group in the Gaza Strip. In their presentation, the South African jurists presented ample quotes from Netanyahu and other members of his government, which were explicit statements of the need to wipe out the Palestinian people, to put an end to the Palestinians in Israel. That's point number 3. Point number 4, Israel must ensure the delivery of basic services and essential humanitarian aid to civilians in Gaza. And in the presentation from the South Africans, they pointed out that it was the Israeli policy to cut off food, healthcare, fuel, and water to the people of Gaza. Point number 5, Israel must prevent the destruction of evidence of war crimes in Gaza and allow fact-finding missions access, which so far they have not done. And number 6, Israel must submit a report on all steps it has taken to abide by the measures imposed by the court within 1 month of the judgment. South Africa will have a chance to respond to this report. Now, what this means is that what we're seeing is a situation which is continuing, in which all of these points the court laid out are being violated by the policy. The conditions facing the people of Gaza remain highly precarious and catastrophic, approaching 27,000 deaths, over 1 million people homeless, displaced and under fire, hungry, stalked by diseases because the healthcare system has been destroyed. Now, when you then hear from this standpoint what the court presented yesterday, what you'll see is that this was, in fact, what we just said, a very significant ruling and an important development in the present period of history. Now, that was the essence of the comments of President Ramaphosa of South Africa, whose country brought the case. Let me have the next post, please. What Ramaphosa said is that this order is binding on Israel and must be respected by all states that are party to the convention, that is the convention of the Genocide Conference. Secondly, we expect Israel, as a self-proclaimed democracy and a state that respects the rule of law, to abide by these measures. And finally, he personally said this marks an important first step in our quest to secure justice for the people of Gaza. In other words, it's not a final determination, but it's an important first step. And what's especially important is that it was brought by South Africa, which has experience in fighting against apartheid, but perhaps even more important, came out of the apartheid period with a policy of reconciliation to give hope to the people of Palestine and Israel that if there's a break with this 75-year policy of Israeli colonization, that there's a good possibility that peace will prevail. Now, we heard from Dr. Naledi Pandor earlier, the Minister of International Relations of South Africa, but I want to give you another quote from her from after this ruling came down. Can I have the next poster, please? She was addressing this question of the lack of a ceasefire order. And here's what she had to say. She said that Israel's powerful international friends will have to take the IJC finding into account. What about Germany and the US declaring that South Africa's filing was meritless? She said, well, it's the court's job to deliberate over the proof of genocide, while those countries that dismissed the suit, including the US and Germany, should pay attention to the provisions about accomplices of genocide. And finally, on this question of, well, why no ceasefire? She said, how do you provide aid and water without a ceasefire? If you read the order of the court by implication, a ceasefire must happen. So again, very clearly, instead of getting trapped in the legalese, the intent of the court was that this is not a meritless case, but has merit, will be heard. They rejected the rebuttal from Israel. And as Pandor said, this now puts a spotlight on the entire policy of the Western world of not just arming Israel, but of providing cover for Israel. Now, of course, for those who were disappointed, take a look at the reaction of the Israelis if you want to see the real disappointment. Their initial public statement was a spin. They declared it a victory because they said there was not a ceasefire required. Well, that's sort of like Nikki Haley's comments that she won Iowa and New Hampshire. It's a defensive reaction, but the real thinking was betrayed by the comments of Netanyahu and some of his accomplices. Netanyahu, speaking on Israeli radio after the ruling, said Israel has the basic right to self-defense. The Hague Tribunal rightly rejected the outrageous demand to deprive us of this right. Well, that's completely wrong. It did not do so. But then he said the very claim that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians is not just false, it is outrageous. And the court's willingness to discuss it at all is a mark of disgrace that will not be erased for generations. So a total defense of the Israeli policy, and Netanyahu has repeatedly insisted that it's going to continue for months if necessary, which makes the importance of the International Court of Justice moving ahead to find for the provisions of the Genocide Convention and applying it to Israel makes it so crucial because Netanyahu's not going to stop. The Defense Minister Gallant also condemned the ruling. He said the International Court of Justice in The Hague went above and beyond when it granted South Africa's anti-Semitic request to discuss the claim of genocide in Gaza, and now refuses to reject the petition outright. So by even investigating the claim of genocide, Gallant says that's anti-Semitic. He went on to say that those who seek justice will not find it on the leather chairs of the court chambers in The Hague. They will find it in the Hamas tunnels in Gaza. Now, Gallant is the one who said it will take months, maybe longer, to finish the operation in Gaza. And then, of course, let's go to the most insane, the National Security Advisor to Netanyahu, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who said the decision of the anti-Semitic court in The Hague proves what was already known. The court does not seek justice, but rather the persecution of the Jewish people. And then he goes on to make a statement which is just patently false and shows his hysteria. He said they were silent during the Holocaust. Well, the International Court of Justice was not set up until after the end of World War II, and therefore and it was actually founded to make sure there would not be a future Holocaust. Then Ben-Gvir goes on to say, today they continue the hypocrisy and take it a step further. Decisions that endanger the continued existence of the State of Israel must not be adhered to. So he's sending out a threat. No nation should abide by this decision. Now, I want to point out there are some other things going on in Israel that are very interesting. Despite the campaign of censorship there, the not allowing the people to hear what's actually occurring in Gaza, today thousands of people are demonstrating in the city of Tel Aviv. There are similar demonstrations in Haifa and other cities demanding the resignation of the Netanyahu government, demanding new elections. And the former Shin Bet chairman, Carmi Gilon, said that he has concluded that Netanyahu does not want to end the war and will do anything to prevent the return of hostages, which might lead to an end of the war. So we're in a situation now where this ruling is shaping a new potential to end not just the war in Gaza, but the occupation of the territory seized in 1967, which has become increasingly bitter and dire as the number of settlers have increased by the plan of the Netanyahu Greater Israel faction to determine the non-Palestinian state by facts on the ground. In other words, that there's no land left for the Palestinians. The idea of the settlers movement taking over more and more territory, so it becomes an impossibility to have a Palestinian state. And Netanyahu has said there will be no Palestinian state, which itself is a violation of the Resolution 242 from the post-1967 war. So we're in a real showdown, and it's not just the government of Netanyahu, which is in the spotlight here and the target here. What about the Biden administration? The Biden administration continues to cry crocodile tears about what's happening to the Palestinians, while it continues the flow of arms, logistical support, and political cover for the Netanyahu fanatics. It's really quite pathetic to see Tony Blinken going around the world talking about how upset he is about the pictures of the suffering of Palestinian children, while he's handing the weapons to the Israel Defense Forces who are killing those children. You think the rest of the world isn't seeing this? And that's why it's especially important what Helga said in the International Peace Coalition call, that the rest of the world is seeing this, and that they're also going to see in the International Court of Justice ruling a moment of truth coming up for Israel. Will Israel abide by this international convention against genocide? Will the U.S., which is a signature for this international convention and is a member of the International Court of Justice, will the U.S. turn its back on natural law and international law, even while it continues to proclaim that it's the most important defender of the rules-based order in the world? So that's why this is such an historic moment. Now, let me just mention some of the other fronts in an overall tense strategic environment where you have wars and would-be wars or potential wars that are coming from the same Anglosphere geopolitical policy of defending the interests of corporate cartels of the unipolar order over the interests of people of sovereign nation states. In Ukraine, we just had the Ramstein meeting number 18. This is a meeting in Germany where the marching orders were given to the NATO countries to provide more weapons, more money, to continue the flow going at a moment when there's great concern in Europe, watching the emergence of Trump as the almost certain Republican presidential candidate, and the opposition to the war in Ukraine growing every day in the United States and in Europe as well. Instead, the NATO members met to make more pledges. There's the Steadfast Defender 24, which is going to be the largest military maneuvers, exercises of NATO ever. At the same time, there's a push to take the seized Russian funds that were taken by the Treasury and U.S. Treasury, Federal Reserve, and other banks, $300+ billion. And if they can't get money through the Congress, in other words, if the people's representatives reject the demand to give more money to Ukraine, they're going to take the stolen funds that belong to the Russians and give it to the Ukrainians. Again, where's the rules-based order there? Then just as a footnote, there was a plane shot down, a Russian plane that had Ukrainian prisoners of war that were going to be repatriated to Ukraine as part of a prisoner of war exchange between Russia and Ukraine. It appears almost definitively that it was the Ukrainians who shot down the plane, killing their own prisoners of war, their own people, and through firing into Russian airspace. Now, we also have a growing danger in the Red Sea, and what's that about? Well, the Houthis are very clear. They say they're going to continue to take action against Israeli ships until the genocide stops. Well, they can now say they have a ruling, or at least the beginnings of a ruling, from the International Court of Justice declaring this to be genocide. Now, finally, let me point out the situation in Europe is highly unstable when it comes to governments. The economies are terrible as a result of sanctions, the cutoff of Russian oil and gas, the green policy throughout Europe. And we've seen an explosion of farm protests. In Germany, over the last 2 weeks, there have been tens of thousands of tractors driving through hundreds of German cities with support from the general population, and now other groups getting involved, truckers, businesses, bakeries. There's now a train strike going on in Germany. We're seeing in France, the highways leading into Paris were shut down by farmers. In Greece, in Italy, farmers are taking to the street. What's their demand? An end to European Union policies, including the funding of the war in Ukraine. Now, in the midst of this, here's something that gives you a sense of what it means to live in a fascist society. Instead of reporting these things, instead of making it clear that instead of saying the farmers are right-wing nationalists protesting the governments, instead of allowing the farmers to speak for themselves, they put words into their mouths, and then even worse, instead of reporting accurately on the ICJ ruling and what's happening with the farmers, they've created a phony story in Germany about an alleged fascist plot to ship immigrants, including immigrants who have been in Germany for years, out of the country, referring to a supposed right-wing conference that took place here in Potsdam. Now, what is interesting is what Helga pointed out, that the idea of removing immigrants from Germany is not only the province of so-called right-wingers. That's the Scholz government's plan. That's the plan that's being mapped out throughout Europe right now in the European Union. How do you throw out immigrants? And instead of addressing the deeper issue that much of this immigration comes from the result of wars that are destroying nations in North Africa and the Middle East, and the International Monetary Fund policies that are destroying economies, that are driving people to take the risk of life in crossing the Mediterranean to come to Europe. Instead, governments in Europe are moving to throw immigrants out. Now, that's not a solution. But then to come up and say that's the policy of the opposition is a cover to try and avoid discussing what are the legitimate concerns of farmers, What are the legitimate concerns of people who are protesting the governments? And so we see how this kind of psychological warfare, the censorship industrial complex, is actually working. Now, finally, what all of this shows is there's a panic in the establishment, and we can discuss this more in the discussion section of the meeting tonight. But what we're seeing is a rejection of the policies of the unipolar order, the permanent war, the economic warfare against populations. It's a rejection, not just from the global south, but increasingly in the global north itself. And that's what, to a large extent, the votes in the US primaries for Trump are showing, that people are very, very unhappy with the establishment. Now, let me end with just an uplifting note. Dennis mentioned the anniversary yesterday of the release of Lyndon LaRouche from prison. Today is the 268th birthday of Wolfgang Mozart, perhaps one of the greatest composers ever, who was a believer in the principles of the American Revolution and who dedicated his life and his art to promoting this idea of, in his sense, of man in the image of God. And I think it would be time well spent to listen to some Mozart tonight as you ponder what you can do to make sure these changes that are occurring can come to fruition.
Thank you, Harley. Now, and we're going to get back to you for questions. Some questions have already begun to come in. But as some of us say, if you want to know what Washington thinks today and is likely to do, ask Wall Street. But if you want to know what Washington will think tomorrow and is likely to propose, you got to ask the City of London. UK's Mike Robinson is going to give us his evaluation of the things and changes that have been happening in the past weeks. But we always like to make the point for those who may be watching for the first time that Lyndon LaRouche did not for nothing insist throughout his entire political career that it is the City of London and British intelligence, etc., which is the kind of starting point to understand what's wrong with America. He didn't mean by that Americans were not responsible for their own foreign policy mistakes and errors. He simply meant that correction is never going to happen unless you understand the nature of the imperial process from which the United States was supposed to break and attempted to break in 1763 through the period of 1783 to 87. And so we always like to have Mike come on because he's always got something startling in its truthfulness that always causes people to take a better look and a more thorough look at what they may be confronting that they'd rather not see. So, Mike, there you are. Here you are. Go right ahead.
Thank you. Well, look, Harley was talking about steadfast defender, and I think that's where we're going to start tonight. So let's just bring a graphic on screen. Steadfast defender is the latest NATO exercise. It's the biggest one for a very, very long time. And I just want to put this in a little bit of context to start off with, because NATO has this page. They call it Setting the Record Straight. And this is all about debunking Russian disinformation on NATO. It was updated on the 12th of January this year. And they say things like Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine has shattered peace in Europe. NATO's strategic concept states that Russia is the most significant and direct threat to allies' security and peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area, and so on. But on this page, they make it clear that this is a fact, according to NATO. NATO exercises and deployments are not directed against Russia. That's what they say. Except Grant Shapps, the Secretary of State for Defence or War in the UK, said this last week, we're in a new era and we must be prepared to deter our enemies, prepared to lead our allies, and prepared to defend our nation whenever the call comes. I can announce today the UK will be sending some 20,000 personnel to take part in one of NATO's largest deployments since the Cold War. And it will see our military joining forces with counterparts from 30 NATO countries plus Sweden providing vital reassurance against the Putin menace. And actually, when we look at what NATO is saying about this exercise, the scenario is about Russia. It's all about Russia. So NATO quite happy to lie in their propaganda, despite the fact that they maintain that that page is all about countering Russian propaganda and disinformation. So just to give you a flavor of NATO's recent propaganda on this, here's a little bit of video that they were pushing out on social media last week.
Welcome to this 190th Military Committee in Chiefs of Defense session. The tectonic plates of power are shifting, and as a result, we face the most dangerous world in decades. NATO has entered into a new era of collective defense, and together we are defending much more than the physical safety of our 1 billion people and 31, soon to be 32, nations. We are defending freedom and democracy.
So NATO is there to defend freedom and democracy. 32 nations soon to be, of course, he's talking about Ukraine. But it's not just Russia that's the enemy. And Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, was at Davos last week. And he had this to say.
It is not longer regional. Security is global. So what happens in Asia matters for Europe, and what happens in Europe matters for Asia. And therefore, of course, we don't regard China as an adversary, but China's heavy investments in modern military capabilities, including more and more advanced nuclear weapons. It is not longer...
Right. Sorry about that. So of course, China is an enemy. But I just wanted to very briefly remind everybody about NATO's current policy, NATO 2030, which was launched in June 2020. This is all about making NATO even stronger. Now, this is moving the focus of NATO, or at least including Asia as well as Europe, because NATO's remit, of course, has up until now been Europe, but they want to move into Asia as well. And a few months after this document was released, this policy document was released, a French retired general, Gregoire Diamantidis, had this to say about it, because the French military establishment weren't terribly happy, at least the retired military establishment. They said NATO 2030 sets out NATO's mission for the next 10 years. From the outset, it is evident that NATO is fully gearing itself towards a two-threat paradigm, a Russian menace, which is presented as already present, and a Chinese menace presented as potential and yet to come. Two key vectors leap out from this NATO 20 policy. First, the marshalling of Europeans against Chinese designs on planetary domination, the quid pro quo for which is US protection of Europe against the Russian threat. Second, the removal in several ways of NATO's previous cornerstone, the rule of consensus and decision-making. And in reading through NATO 2030, what clearly emerges is a monument of quiet bad faith, surreptitious disinformation, and exploiting the Russian threat, a threat blatantly created and subsequently maintained to make European allies toe the US line in preparation for the looming struggle with China for global hegemony. Not only do you plan to transform defensive NATO into an offensive alliance against an enemy that's not Europe's enemy, though we're not fooled about China's ambitions, he said, the report goes further, squarely heading for an organization where the world's political ambition holding sway over all other international organizations, not content with having wrecked Europe's chance of a real and lasting peace desired by all. NATO, motivated only by self-preservation and overreach, has triggered a massive rearmament. And now through this NATO 2030 document, you seek to justify the military purpose of this alliance by transforming it into a political instrument that even can override UN resolutions and national sovereignty. This defies elementary logic, which dictates that the mission should justify the tool and not vice versa. And he went on to say, so no, Mr. Secretary General, we must stop this mad train before it's too late. Now, of course, the mad train hasn't been stopped. NATO continuing to expand eastwards into Asia. A few examples here, the trilateral United States, Japan, Republic of Korea, Indo-Pacific dialogue, We've got AUKUS, of course, which is sorry, we could come on to AUKUS in a second. First of all, the potential NATO office in Japan. This is a bit uncertain whether it's going to go ahead, but certainly the plans in June 2023 were that it should. The AUKUS partnership, this is the UK, the United States, and Australia. And what else have we got here? We've got more Indo-Pacific stuff. So my point here is the expansion of the war drums, absolutely moving into South Asia as well. Jens Stoltenberg had a few more comments to make.
China's way of behavior, especially in the South China Sea, and the way China is actually violating core principles for NATO, democracy, the rule of law, journalism, freedom of expression, as we have seen in Hong Kong, all of that matters for NATO. And we also have to understand that this is not about NATO moving into Asia, but it's about the fact that China is coming closer to us. We see them in Africa, we see them in the Arctic, we see them trying to control critical infrastructure. Not so many years ago, I had a big discussion about 5G. And many allies said this is only a commercial issue. No, it's also an issue about our security.
Sorry, did that again. Right, so we should remember why they're so concerned about 5G. And again, this is something which began in Britain because the militaries in Europe, particularly in Britain, are beginning to use civil infrastructure for military communication. So they are attempting to move, or they are, in the UK at least, removing all Chinese infrastructure from 5G networks, for example. But anyway, these were the comments from NATO over the last week or two. And this started then to arrive in the European press with various comments. So here is Bild, and they were saying, if we do a quick translation of that headline, that the Bundeswehr is preparing for a Putin attack. And we started getting, over the last week or so, fear porn, let's call it, in the Western media, in the UK and the European press, about what was apparently an imminent attack from Russia, and we've got to be particularly concerned about it. This was the Daily Mail. Germany fears Putin could start World War III, are justified, and Vladimir will do the unthinkable if he feels NATO are unprepared. Former commander of US forces in Europe warns after Berlin's secret plans to tackle Russian attack are revealed. So this was Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. The Mail quotes him as saying, the UK has always been aware of the threat from Russia. And of course, the UK has always been aware of that because we have invented it. It didn't exist. We created the propaganda which claims that Russia is a threat. And we did that for many years via the Integrity Initiative. And this was a UK Foreign Office funded propaganda machine, which unfortunately for the UK government came to light in 2018. And so it fell apart in a sense, but it has, although the Integrity Initiative itself has disappeared, the propaganda machine hasn't, and the narrative about Russia being a threat to the West hasn't. Hodges went on to say this, he said, but now Germany is realizing this is something that is only going to get worse if they're not prepared. So readiness is exactly what nations should be doing, and Germany is doing that. If the civilian leadership doesn't think there's a threat, they won't be able to move quickly enough. Our leaders should talk to us like adults. It doesn't mean you're scaremongering. It means you're taking precautions, which is exactly what we should be doing. Well, unfortunately, scaremongering is exactly what happened, because then around the same time in Sweden, the Swedish Minister of Civil Defense got up at a public meeting and said it's time for the country to prepare for war. The Swedish Prime Minister then decided he was going to tell the Swedish people to be prepared to die in arms in defense of values. And as a result, people in Sweden started making preparations. They started going out and buying torches, battery-powered radios, a whole bunch of stuff that they needed to do, and so on. And that resulted in this response from Admiral Barr that we saw earlier on.
And the fact that people find it a surprise and as a result buy a radio on batteries, that is great. It is part of the package that the Swedish government is talking about. You need to have water, you need to have a radio on batteries, and you need to have a flashlight on batteries to make sure that you can survive the first 36 hours. Things like that. That's simple things. But it starts there. The realization that not everything is plannable, not everything is going to be hunky-dory in the next 20 years. I'm not saying it is going wrong tomorrow, but we have to realize it's not a given that we are in peace. And that's why we have the plans. That's why we are preparing for a conflict with Russia and the terror groups, if it comes to it, if they attack us. We're not seeking any conflict. But if they attack us, we have to be ready.
So we're not seeking any conflict, he lied. In the UK, it got even worse. The UK held an event a few days ago, the International Armoured Vehicles event. It took place, it's being run by Defence IQ, an organisation in the UK. And Patrick Sanders, who is the outgoing Chief of the Defence Staff, was speaking at it. And saying very clearly the government will need to mobilize the nation in the event of war with Russia. And this resulted in various headlines across the mainstream press talking about conscription, that Patrick Sanders was really talking about conscription. The Telegraph, public face call-up, if we go to war, military chief warns, was the headline. And although they said that the army chief would not support conscription, it's understood, but believes there should be a shift in the mindset of regular British people, where they think more like troops who are mentally prepared that war with Russia could happen. So this kind of rhetoric, this fear-mongering, this scaremongering, absolutely hit the headlines over the last few days, and so on. So our favourite propagandist, Tobias Ellwood, who some people will know is still, although he is an MP, is still a reservist with 77 Brigade, the government's propaganda machine. He reacted to Sanders' comments with this.
Life has gone well. It's now going to get more difficult as authoritarian states exploit our timidity, our perhaps reluctance to really put fires out. And the best example of that is a democracy on the corner of Eastern Europe that in its third year is now in conflict, and we've not resolved that. So Patrick Sanders is saying, prepare for what's coming over the horizon. There is a 1939 feel to the world right now. These authoritarian states are rearming. There's a risk averseness about the West in wanting to deal with that. And institutions, global institutions such as the United Nations, aren't able to hold these errant nations to account. In fact, the UN, I'd go further, is reaching its League of Nations moment unless it's reformed.
Now, this issue of United Nations reform is something that Britain is pushing extremely hard. And the reason, as we mentioned, I think I mentioned this the last time I was on this program, the reason is because Russia and China have consistently over the last number of years been using the veto in the Security Council to try to prevent war and regime change operations and these types of things. They have used the veto to scupper the plans of the British and the Americans and so on. United Nations reform is all about Security Council reform as far as Tobias Ellwood is concerned. But the message is we've got to start thinking about moving the country onto a war footing. Let's just have a quick look at the response from the general public to that attitude from politicians. This is one example. F off, send the politicians. If you want conscription, send them to the front line. Another one here, I've identified the first batch for conscription, showing an image of the House of Commons. Let's see what else we've got. Mainstream media matrix working overtime right now to push globalist agenda. More wartime conscription nonsense and digital ID garbage. Resist both is another comment. Not sure I can think anything more dismally pathetic than a parade of fat middle-aged alcoholic hacks lining up to proclaim themselves ready to submit to conscription that will never happen, into an army that doesn't want them to fight a war that doesn't exist. And of course, talking about journalists there. Then in terms of actually going to fight for the British government at all, the British people are saying things like the chances of your own government killing you is much higher than Putin. I'll fight the UK government, but not Russia. The only time I'll be willing to fight is against our government. Russia is not the enemy, UK government is. I'll be happy to come home, UK, and fight against the government, that is, and so on. You see the sentiment. Another example, would you honestly send your sons and daughters to die for these lying showers of, well, you can see the language that's being used there. And then this isn't a flash in the pan. Expect more psychological nudges on conscription, especially from client media like the BBC. And this is the key point, because while the war drums are beating, there's nothing there behind them, at least as far as the British military is concerned, because we've given away everything that we have to Ukraine, not just the UK either, other countries in Europe as well in the same situation. In fact, I think the worst case is Slovakia, which has literally nothing left to defend itself and is totally reliant on other countries to provide any kind of defense capability for that country at all. But just to give an idea of the situation Britain is in, Britain has 0 active naval supply ships for the first time. And then we've got a whole raft of military bases closing in the UK. Now, this report was originally published in 2020, but you can get an idea of what's happening 2023, 2024, 2025, 2027. It's all shut down right into 2031, here, 2032. And even the recruitment issue for the traditional military is, it has broken down to a degree. And so the Times here reporting earlier in the month, Royal Navy forced to advertise for a Rear Admiral on LinkedIn because they have no staff. So if we have no capability in the UK to actually prosecute a war, then what is all this conscription talk about? We've been talking I've been talking as previous appearances here about censorship, about the way the UK government is treating the UK people, the concern that they have about the fact that they have lost control of the narrative and so on. And so I think it's more likely that, at least as far as the UK is concerned and UK population is concerned, this is a psychological operation in a sense. If the country is put on a war footing, we can bring in emergency legislation, as we did during the pandemic. We had the Coronavirus Act, which put severe restrictions on freedom of movement and lockdown and all the rest that went on at that time. We also remind everybody have the Online Safety Act. That then takes another step up should we end up on a war footing. But the other benefit for the government of pushing this type of narrative comes with the likes of this. So this is our deputy permanent representative in the United Nations saying that the Ukraine war, he was talking about the Ukraine war in this case a couple of days ago, this war benefits no one, not Russians and certainly not Ukrainians. But of course it does benefit somebody, and that's the military-industrial complex. And while we are perhaps not in a position to prosecute any kind of war at the moment, what this also does is justify ramping up military spending and defense spending. And so as a result, we have this situation. This is just the London situation, the share price for defense and aerospace industry. And we're seeing the way that has gone since the end of the pandemic. So 69.72% rise in stock prices in defense and aerospace in the past 12 months. But if we go back there, if you look on the graph to what's that, about November or so, 2020, that's about a 300% increase. So clearly somebody is benefiting from all this war and talk of war. But we should never forget that how cynical the British government and British politicians can be with respect to war, because they don't give a damn about the deaths. They give a damn about the opportunities. Now in London, the Mayor of London has imposed a net zero policy, which has resulted in what they describe as the ultra low emission zone. And this means that people that own cars over a certain age or that have diesel engines rather than petrol engines, those cars are no longer legal to have in London unless you pay quite an exorbitant amount of money to the London local government. Now, there was a letter sent to the Mayor of London by the Secretary of State for transport, Mark Harper, and that was sent just before Christmas. So let's just look at the text of this, or a little bit of the text of this, because he said, he was in reply, this was in reply to a letter from the Mayor of London saying, "Thank you for your letter, also signed by the Right Honourable Ben Wallace MP, seeking my department's support in allowing suitable vehicles to be donated to Ukraine through the ULEZ scrappage scheme." He went on to say, as Russia's barbaric invasion of Ukraine nears its second anniversary, it's vital the UK stands in the forefront of supporting both Ukraine's government and its people in its valiant fight. Given your ULEZ expansion scrappage scheme has been in effect since August 23, I'm surprised that you haven't made contact until now, given the clear opportunity that your scrappage scheme could provide in allowing roadworthy vehicles to be sent to Ukraine. So Ukraine, not only the dumping ground for all the military hardware that we wanted to get rid of, but also now the dumping ground for cars that are no longer allowed to be driven in the centre of London or owned by people living in the centre of London. This is how cynical it gets. But then Harley was mentioning to me a day or two ago about the secret plan, the alleged secret plan to send more Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine. Now, this deal was supposed to be a deal done between, or at least a suggestion of a deal done between the UK and Germany, that the UK would send Storm Shadows to Ukraine if Germany would provide Taurus cruise missiles to the UK. And this didn't get, the Telegraph was really the only UK newspaper that covered this story, and the Germans denying that, or at least they've declined to comment on it. But I say that the Telegraph, the only UK newspaper that seemed to cover this at any way. But I would just draw some parallels here, because if we remember a couple of, or 18 months ago or so, this idea of a swap was also lauded with respect to F-16s, that perhaps Poland, for example, might be able to give some of their older MiG-29s to Ukraine and have those, well, in this case, replaced with Eurofighters, which is the European fighter jet, and so on. So whether that deal over cruise missiles or long-range missiles is going to be done remains to be seen. But we thought it was worth mentioning at this stage. Now, there's just one other thing that I want to mention, and that is something from Syria. Now, I want to bring this organization on screen. This is a Berlin group. This is a group of individuals, academics and others that have been working to try to expose the corruption of the OPCW. This is the Office for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, in their investigations into the Duma so-called alleged chemical weapon attack, which took place in April 2018. And these people have been working with people inside the OPCW to try to get some clarity on what happened in Duma. Now, I'll very brief. I'm not going to read this out. I'll briefly put the Foreign Office statement up from April 2018. They were saying, this was a disgraceful chemical weapons attack. Of course, we call on the Assad regime and its backers, Russia and Iran, to stop the violence against innocent civilians, and so on. So the Foreign Office made this statement at the time. A couple of years later, the Berlin 21 group put out their statement of concern about the Duma investigation by the OPCW, because what was absolutely clear was that political influence had caused the OPCW to change the report with respect to Syria. And of course, this is an example of the type of geopolitics and the type of imperialist policy that we see that drives these wars. So anyway, the statement of concern, I just want to read a few lines of it very briefly. We wish to express our deep concern over the protracted controversy and political fallout surrounding the OPCW and its investigation of the alleged chemical weapons attacks in Duma, Syria on the 7th of April 2018. Since the publication by the OPCW of its final report in March 2019, a series of worrying developments has raised serious and substantial concerns with respect to the conduct of that investigation. These developments include instances in which OPCW inspectors involved with the investigation have identified major procedural and scientific irregularities, the leaking of a significant quantity of corroborating documents, and damning statements provided to the UN Security Council meetings. It's now well established that some senior inspectors involved with the investigation, one of whom played a senior role, reject how the investigation derived its conclusions, and OPCW management now stands accused of accepting unsubstantiated or possibly manipulated findings with the most serious geopolitical and security implications. We call on the Director General of the OPCW to find the courage to address the problems within his organization relating to this investigation and ensure states, parties, and United Nations are informed accordingly. In this way, we hope and believe that the credibility and integrity of the OPCW can be restored. And that was signed by Jose Bustani, the first Director General of the OPCW and former ambassador to the UK and France, Chomsky, Andrew Cockburn, Professor Richard Falk, Tulsi Gabbard, and you can see Catherine Gunn, former GCHQ, a bunch of other names on there. Oliver Stone's name is on that list as well. The reason I'm mentioning this now is because, of course, this report, the incorrectness of this report has never progressed. At least the issue still exists. And so the Berlin 21 group has released a statement basically saying this, if I can just get it to right, it's not going to come on screen for a second. So it says, UN failure together with the unwillingness of OPCW management to agree to reopen the Duma file encourages the Berlin Group 21 to intensify its 2024 efforts to support government and non-government follow-ups and seeking a credible reassessment of the Duma materials and so on. So this issue needs to be resolved because it is the credibility of United Nations institutions that's at stake here, and the OPCW in particular. And as we move back onto a war footing, the politicization of United Nations institutions, it makes it much more difficult to oppose the type of war propaganda that we've seen from the UK and Europe and the United States. So that's what I've got for you today.
Yep, as usual, you're doing your job. Mike, let me just start out and ask Harley if he's got any questions. We've gotten a few questions that have come in as a result of this. I have a couple around the last thing you raised, but Harley, any response either to what Mike said as such or any other things that should be added?
Yeah, let me say it's really great that you pull these things together in the way that you do, because what you just demonstrated is that, in fact, the term you use is absolutely right, fear-mongering. The creation of a completely non-existent threat. And where does that come from? Well, you have the think tanks like the Atlantic Council, Chatham House, Heritage Foundation, that are funded by the military-industrial financial complex, as well as the governments of the UK and the United States, to push increased defense spending and the advancement of this idea of global NATO. Now, what's the whole idea for global NATO? To counter the threat of China, or more particularly the threat of the Belt and Road Initiative to the collapsing existing financial system. Now, what's the great threat from China? That they might build a high-speed railroad in your country, or a power plant, or put money into for water management and water purification? You know, the other thing they're using for fear-mongering is the idea that there's an axis of evil, a term which came from the discredited war on terror network around the war criminals of the Bush Jr. administration. You know, the idea that North Korea, China, Russia, Iran, that they represent a new threat to the security of the world. Now, I think that's why this case brought by South Africa is so important. The war criminals, I mean, who's been doing these wars? Who's responsible for more deaths and more destruction than the US and NATO? You look at Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. and the long-term effects, because it wasn't just that they destroyed the government of Libya, but they wrecked the infrastructure, which led to a significant number of deaths from flooding just 10 years after the Libyan war. So what the case brought by South Africa on the question of Israeli genocide in Gaza brings up the issue of accountability. And I think this is really important, that the real criminal regimes are being put on notice by this. And we cannot just rely on the justices of a court. It really is in the court of public opinion. And as we saw from Lynn, the problem with public opinion is that it's too often based on simple sloganeering or refusal to think more deeply. But when you have a moment such as now where the genocide is clear and the case being brought on it was very straightforward and eloquent, it's a chance to move the population into the discussion and engagement. And so that's the reason I think it's so important that this ruling came out yesterday from the International Court of Justice. And people should download it, should read the charges that were made, and go out and organize the way the group did in the clip we saw from Stewart's meeting in Michigan.
Okay, there's several questions. I'm going to go to some of them now. There's sort of a three-part question, and we'll take that one and I have a one or two other matters. But let's just take this. The question was, person says, here's a question, though I'm not sure if it's appropriate, but I actually think it's a useful thing for us to address. And Harley, you may want to do a little bit of work with this. Quote, what is the relationship between the City of London and the Zionists? Are they rival gangs working together, etc.? Since we have been plagued by this question for decades, it might be useful to take this up in this particular location. The other two things, I think I can wait, the other parts of the question.
Well, that's an obvious setup question because it's so truthful. Look, the Zionist movement was created in the end of the 19th century by the British. And before you had a single Jewish organization supporting transfer of Jews from Europe to Israel, you had the British Zionists, the Christian Zionists that were centered around Prince Albert, the Palestine Exploration Fund, the idea that actually goes back to the Cromwell period, that in order to have the second coming of Christ, you have to have the transport of all Jews from all corners of the earth to Israel. And this was a serious operation from the British, which was during the period of World War I, when the fate of the countries of the so-called Middle East was being determined. Where was it being determined? On the ground? No, it was in private, secret negotiations between Sykes and Picot, the British and the French, and then pushed ahead by the 1917 Balfour Declaration, where Arthur Balfour drafted a letter to Lord Rothschild in which he said that it's British policy to establish a homeland for the Jews after the war. Now, that's where this whole thing came from. And it's the City of London. The people who say that it's Israel that runs the United States and the Western governments are missing the point. Israel has been a tool that's been used in the first part, in the 19th and 20th century by the British for the purposes of British geopolitics, to prevent the establishment of a land connection and a sea connection through the ports of the Southwest Asia that would challenge the British control of trade and commerce over the seas. And that's what geopolitics is about. Forget all this popular term of geopolitics this, geopolitics that. The origin of geopolitics is the British imperial plan for maintaining the primacy of financial and trade interests in the hands of the City of London. And increasingly, as the city was losing its power, not so much the city, but the British economy, the British manufacturing industry, as Mike was pointing out, the British military, they made a decision after World War I to incorporate the United States as a junior partner. Now, the United States was not gung-ho for this. Originally, there was opposition to it, but they set up the Council on Foreign Relations. That is, Chatham House did that to create an outpost in the United States promoting British geopolitics. And a part of that was the establishment of the State of Israel as a force to be used to disrupt the potential of either Russia or any other country from Europe or China, or even the emergence of sovereign nations such as Egypt and Iran and Iraq as powers that might decide for their own national interests to oppose the control by the British. And of course, we see that with the coup against Mossadegh in Iran, the battles that have gone on, including the Muslim Brotherhood against the people of Egypt and so on. So this is a long-standing relationship that the City of London, in the same way they used left and right counter-gang terrorism in Africa and Ireland, the same thing was done in the Middle East. And there's a fascinating book, it's over my shoulder, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, by Harley, which just goes through the British intention of playing off the Palestinians and the Zionists from the period of World War I up through the present. So I think it's indisputable. And we're seeing now who are the defenders of the Netanyahu regime policy in Gaza. It's the networks that are connected to the City of London, the Biden administration, the Sunak administration, the puppet regime in Germany of Chancellor Scholz. So, I think that's a starting point for looking at this. Lyndon LaRouche was in the middle of a fight against this because going back to the mid-70s, he was promoting a peace plan based on breaking the power of these imperial interests over the economics of these nations. And that's what the Oasis Plan was about. So if people want to get an inside sense of what this fight was about, you need to read the many development reports that LaRouche drafted during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, up through to the period just before his passing, of what could be done if the power of the City of London would be broken by the emergence of a new force. And that's exactly what's happening today with the Global South, with the BRICS, and so on.
Dennis, can I just add one thing to that? I recently interviewed Clifford Kirikoff for the UK column on the origins of Christian Zionism, and I'm sorry if Cliff's watching. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of his book, but I do recommend his book on the origins of Christian Zionism if anybody wants to get a bit more background on that.
Okay, very good, Mike. I'm going to have a question for you. In fact, I'll ask you the question right now, but I'm going to respond in part. We have something important around the question of Zionism. We'll show a good example of Zionist policy in action. And this is Zbigniew Brzezinski on the border of Afghanistan back prior to the creation of the Afghanistan war.
U.S. National Security Advisor Brzezinski flew to Pakistan to set about rallying resistance. He wanted to arm the Mujahideen without revealing America's role. On the Afghan border near the Khyber Pass, he urged the soldiers of God to redouble their efforts.
We know of their deep belief in God, and we are confident that their struggle will succeed. That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
The purpose of coordinating with the Pakistanis will be to make the Soviets bleed for as much and as long.
Okay, so there's a good example of Zionism for you. That is, it's the same thing. Just think about it, right? What was Brzezinski doing? And by the way, he only admitted to this in 1998, that the Afghanistan war that began on December 24th of 1979 was actually fomented by Brzezinski in the summer of 79, using this particular tactic and appearing not to be involved. It was called the Islamic Fundamentalist Card. It wasn't original with Brzezinski. It came from a man by the name of Bernard Lewis, the Ark of Crisis policy. So we put this in because that's the way to understand the reality of this matter. The question, Mike, that they were going to ask you is, what's a reliable source to learn about the nature of the Anglo deep state? And I think the idea is you did all this, so go ahead.
A reliable source for the Anglo deep state. Well, aside from the UK column, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, that's the point. That's why you're here.
Look, quite honestly, a really good source of information is to go back through all of the previous EIRs. There's a whole bunch of stuff from historical EIRs and other LaRouche publications, which covers this stuff in great depth. So I don't think you actually need to go too much further than that.
Yeah.
Hey, Dennis,
I think go ahead. Sure.
Let me just say something on that, because the clip from Brzezinski brings to mind the repeated efforts of people like John McCain and Lindsey Graham in that tradition. McCain appearing in Syria with representatives of ISIS and Al-Qaeda talking about the importance of the support for democracy in Syria. And then McCain and Lindsey Graham with the Azov battalion in Ukraine, claiming they knew nothing about these guys being Nazis, but talking about how the United States will give them the means to defeat the Russians. I believe it was in 2017. So this is a long-standing tradition, and it's not very well known, but the Brzezinski role was extremely important in luring, in the policy in the Carter administration, of destabilizing Afghanistan to lure the Soviet Union into Afghanistan in the first place, precisely for what you mentioned, the Bernard Lewis plan, which was to use and foment Islamic rebellions on the southern border of Russia, what Brzezinski called the Ark of Crisis. So it's a long-standing American tradition, but where did they get it from? Go back to Brigadier General Frank Kitson and the British policy in Africa. And you can also look at the British policy in Northern Ireland, the gang counter-gang strategy.
Here's a question for you, Harley, which also sort of gets us into the area of the alternative. The question is, how should the financial system be structured? Libertarians object to the Federal Reserve, but were the national banks of the 19th century actually a good alternative? That's the question.
We have to be specific with that, because there were other national banks besides Hamilton's Bank of the United States. There's a big difference between Hamilton's Bank of the United States, which was established specifically to counter the power of private financial interests that we see congregated in the hands of the Federal Reserve as an institution of the private banks. The Fed is not a government institution. It's basically owned by the largest banks, the JP Morgan Chase, the Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and so on. And they make the policy. Now, the libertarians argue that you should have no banks of that sort. You should have a return to a gold monetary system where credit is limited to the amount of gold that's available. What Hamilton understood is that still leaves the power in the hands of private interests. Especially what Hamilton was aware of is the role of the British in using the gold specie system as the basis of international finance and investment and trade. And if you know, even to this day, the price of gold is set every day in the Rothschild Bank in London. So the question then is, how do you have a credit system which generates credit not for the sake of control or creating new debt for control, but credit to enhance the physical development of an economy, to bring together the scientists and entrepreneurs and productive workers to create new wealth from physical production. And that's what the Hamiltonian system was all about. That's what the Lincoln policy was that was implemented to make sure the North won the Civil War, the so-called greenback policy. That's what FDR did with the creation of a number of different institutions to bypass the Fed as part of the New Deal. That's what Kennedy was moving toward with the executive order in June 1963, creating Treasury notes instead of Federal Reserve notes. So there are plenty of examples of that, and that's in fact what LaRouche advocated, and that's what we're seeing now, beginning in its early form with the BRICS, with the new development bank, with the policies of the Russian economist Sergei Glaziev, who took this idea and is now promoting it for the Eurasian Economic Union. So it's not a mystery, it's not a secret that the alternative is not a total free market controlled by precious metals or a Federal Reserve system. It's the American Hamiltonian national credit system. And that includes a very significant role for regulation, not foolish, frivolous regulation, but regulation that prevents private interests from cornering the market on who issues credit.
Okay, Mike, we have just sort of a combination of things. So on the one hand, there's the strategic defender exercise of NATO, 90,000 people, 31 plus nations, as they say. But then there's also what you raised, which was that the physical condition of the British military shows that this the array of processes that's underway are questionable. How that they can't really deliver, even though you can do a maneuver. What's the significance? But I would add, the question involved is clearly the Russians are very concerned about the maneuver, and is the maneuver capable of, for example, provoking something like a thermonuclear war or a confrontation of a Third World War variety? That's kind of basically the question that people are asking.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are in a very dangerous situation at the moment. I think that the rhetoric from the West against Russia is being taken very seriously by Russia. I think that although Russia must look at the state of our militaries and the amount of material that we have already used in the Ukraine conflict, they must look at that and say that we have depleted our capability to a fairly large degree. I still don't think they're underestimating the insanity of our politicians to do more. And I think that just listening to the language in this last couple of weeks from politicians right across Europe, I don't know what the situation has been in the United States. I haven't seen that quite so much, but certainly in Europe, it's been very, very clear that people are being warned that Russia is a threat, and they are looking to reestablish military production again. But in the meantime, we have the risk of escalation of what's happening with Israel, that could spread. We've got already the United States and the UK bombing Yemen. They're not bombing Yemen very successfully, it seems, because they don't seem to be succeeding in restricting Ansarallah's capability to continue to damage shipping going through the Red Sea, and another ship attacked today and badly damaged. So you know, two major airstrikes, or at least two airstrikes on Yemeni launch points, and apparently no restriction on the capability of the Yemenis to continue their action. So, you know, we're demonstrating an inability to achieve the goals that we claim that we're setting. But the Russians, I don't think, are in any way laughing at the West, or at least seeing it as not a threat. And I think they are absolutely threatened by what's happening with Steadfast Defender. So, you know, are our politicians stupid enough to do something to start a hot war at some point? I think that's very possible. I don't think it's their intention at this stage, but I think it is something that could happen.
Okay. What we're going to do, we have a final question for you, Harley. And we're going to, before we have the question, we're going to introduce a short video clip because it bears on the question that's being asked. And the video clip is of Dennis Meadows, the author of Limits to Growth. Not exactly sure from what time period it's taken, but let's roll it and then we'll ask the question.
The planet can support something like 1 billion people, maybe 2 billion, depending on how much liberty and how much material consumption you want to have. If you want more liberty and more consumption, you have to have fewer people. And conversely, you can have more people. I mean, we could even have 8 or 9 billion probably if we have a very strong dictatorship, which is smart. Unfortunately, you never have smart dictatorships. They're always stupid. So, but if you had a smart dictatorship and a low standard of living, you can have it. But we want to have freedom and we want to have a high sentence. So we're going to have 1 billion people. And we're now at 7, so we have to get back down. I hope that this can be slow, relatively slow, and that it can be done in a way which is relatively equal, you know, so that people share the experience and you don't have a few rich, you know, trying to force everybody else to deal with it. So those are my hopes. I mean, these are pretty pessimistic hopes, you know, but I mean, that's what lies ahead.
Okay, and I'm informed by Jose that that's from 2017. Okay, so here's the question, Harley, for you. It's actually from Anastasia. She says, one thing that I've been thinking about is, now that we have some people who have decided to have moral courage to stand against evil and demand justice, particularly notably what happened in Michigan that we just showed, I believe this is the necessary change to create a just security and development architecture, such as Helga LaRouche has been calling for. What are your thoughts on how to shape this? Many I'm talking to are very open to discussing the end of all wars, that this isn't going to end with Israel. So what are your thoughts?
Let me start with a couple things on the clip with Meadows. The idea of a smart dictatorship, that's what the Greens want. They want a dictatorship which can limit population. And the way they would do that is precisely as he said, by saying there's finite resources, and therefore the only way to have freedom and prosperity is to limit the number of people. It's a complete fraud, a historic fraud, a scientific fraud. The fact is that an expanding division of labor with access to increased efficiencies in energy production and so on is the way that you actually provide prosperity and freedom. And this was the essence of Lyndon LaRouche's work on potential relative population density and the related concept of energy flux density. You put together the idea of a growing population that is increasing, has increased access to the capability to apply creative discovery to the means of production. That's how you can allow for the increase in population without having to immiserate everyone. But if you start to say we can't apply these advances in technology and science, get rid of nuclear, get rid of fossil fuels, come up with the CO2 hoax and so on, then you're going to need a dictatorship to enforce it, because you're going to create wars. There'll be scarcity and wars. Now, this gets to the question that you were bringing up. How do you achieve a just security and development architecture? And the answer is really within that phrase, security and development architecture. The process of economic development, where each individual has an opportunity to develop their creative powers in such a way as to contribute to the advances in science and technology and the increase in the productivity of every employed worker. That's how you achieve peace. That's what is the essence of LaRouche's Oasis Plan. You know, the argument that you hear from the Greater Israel fanatics is there's not enough land in the Middle East, so we can't afford to share it with the Palestinians who don't want to share it anyway. And it's nearly an excuse for an ethnic cleansing against the Palestinian population. Well, if you look at what was the essence of the idea from LaRouche, which was incompletely involved in the Oslo process, but was verging in that direction, the basis for peace in Southwest Asia was an economic policy that was of benefit both to the Israelis and the population of the Palestinian state. The use of nuclear power for desalination, which, by the way, was attacked by Paul Wolfowitz in his 1972 doctoral dissertation, who said that the problem is not lack of water. Well, of course it is, because if you don't have enough potable water for development of agriculture and also just for drinking and for other uses, you're going to have fights over the water that exists. And that's what's been characteristic of that region. So LaRouche took this question much more profoundly, that what's needed is the cooperation, cooperation and development that would be of mutual benefit, that would overcome the years of division, which were largely the result of the way the British, through the League of Nations, set up the mandates after World War I to pit the Zionists against the Palestinians. So I think the whole question that's been raised in the 10 fundamental principles of Helga Zepp LaRouche gets at this question. I mean, what she's working with is this idea of how you use these concepts of her husband, Lyndon LaRouche, potential relative population density, energy flux, increases in energy flux density, and so on, that's the basis for coming up with economic policies which are for the benefit of everyone. The concept of the Peace of Westphalia, you act for the benefit of the other, and that's how you achieve peace. This was Pope Paul VI. Development is the new name of peace. And so if you actually think that through, you realize what a psychotic Dennis Meadows was with his project, which was one of the more important cornerstones of the radical environmentalism, which put us in this course toward the reduction of adequate energy supplies for populations. So, I mean, that's what I would say in answer to that.
Thanks a lot. As we are about to wind up, want to ask you, Mike, because this is sort of a general question people always have. British Prime Ministry, British government is notable for the number of different prime ministers that have come and gone in the last couple of years. What is the circumstance there now in terms of increased destabilization or not of the government? What are we looking at in the context of obviously the process, there's the American presidential elections, everybody's looking at those here. But in terms of instability in England itself, what is that situation as of now?
Well, we have, let's see, we're going to have a general election this year as well, probably. We have to have one at some point before the end of January 2025, so it's likely to be before Christmas. we have a prime minister who is running from one crisis to the next. So he has, in his last reshuffle of cabinet posts, he has brought David Cameron, the former prime minister, back into the cabinet as the foreign secretary. And already, even at this stage, this close to general election this year, there are efforts to remove Rishi Sunak from the prime ministership and replace him with someone else. Now, who would that be? Who knows? Maybe it could even be Cameron. So anything is possible at this point. On the Labour Party side, since they got rid of Corbyn, that got rid of any prospect of an anti-war policy. We have Keir Starmer is the leader of the Labour Party, the supposed opposition. Keir Starmer is a puppet of Tony Blair. And so effectively what we have at this point, we could say that the next Prime Minister is likely to be Keir Starmer. That effectively puts Tony Blair back in the premiership in this country. You can imagine what the outcome of that will be. We have the situation in common with many other countries around the world at the moment that rather than having a political party, a government and an opposition, we have effectively a uni-party system. So everybody is in agreement on everything. There's no real opposition to anything at the moment. And so from a policy point of view, policies just flow through the system and new legislation comes out the other end. And so the only, from the actual established political parties at the moment, the only opportunities are that this current regime is, at least Rishi Sunak, is replaced with someone else. But in terms of stability, things are pretty stable because no matter how controversial the politicians themselves remain, as I say, there is no effective opposition here to the war policy at the moment.
Okay, and Harley, we're going to ask you to make a comment. We have Diane Sayre, the independent candidate for United States Senate in the state of New York, had issued a statement prior to yesterday's decision by the International Court of Justice. I'll just read a part of what she said. She said, "Whatever the decision of the court, I believe South Africa's action in bringing the suit was correct. And I want it known that as a candidate for United States Senator, I agree fundamentally with their position. This is the more urgent because over 200 unprincipled and or cowardly members of the United States House of Representatives have added their names to a reprehensible letter sent on January 23rd to Secretary of State Tony Blinken, characterizing South Africa's very well-documented and thorough case as, quote, grossly unfounded. Either they are lying or have not bothered to read the 84-page report or both." Now, I want to just ask you a couple questions, Harley. Clearly, it's been now established fully that the case of South Africa was not unfounded. That is minimally what the nations of the world have clearly established, thus placing these 200 members of the House of Representatives, many of whom are lawyers, by the way, in a peculiar position. And of course, we saw at the beginning of the show, at the top of the show, one such congressperson baffled, dazed, and confused when they found themselves facing constituents who actually were making an actual demand that they couldn't actually respond to. So given, again, the obvious peculiar circumstance of the American presidential elections, and also the action that you see here in a contrasting way that Diane took, Harley, any comments you have as we close about how American citizens confronted with this situation ought to act such that they're not caught up in the epidemic of stupidity that often characterizes these processes?
Well, I find it interesting that Blinken and the State Department said the South African filing was, quote, without merit, unquote. I would argue that the opinion of those 200 congressmen, in fact, is without merit. because as Diane mentioned, either they hadn't read the report, which is fairly convincing. I mean, if you have the head of state, in the case of Netanyahu and also Herzog, the president of Israel, saying that the Palestinian people are animals, that it would be better if they were driven out, if they were removed from the land. How is that not a violation of international law? So how would that be without merit to bring that to the attention of the International Court? So as you mentioned, a lot of these congressmen are lawyers, but they're also political prostitutes. They're looking for funds. Where do funds come from? Well, there are two big sources which tend to be forcing or forming a coalition. The so-called Zionist lobby in the United States, which is defense of anything Israel, and those congressmen who take their money from the military-industrial financial complex, and also the opinions from those institutions. So, how do you deal with this? Well, I hope people who are watching this program today will circulate the material that we're presenting, especially about what the court actually said and the implications of that, but then even more importantly, work on the process of thinking the way Lyndon LaRouche said Americans have to think, strategically, about the whole world, about the past, the present, and the future, and use the idea of the future to shape your actions in the present. If you want a future, we have to make sure that those opinions that are without merit from these idiots in the Congress are laughed at, and instead that people seek the kind of information that's needed to make a qualified judgment. And in my own unbiased view, the best place to go for that, as Mike was saying, is to the publications of the LaRouche organization, particularly the writings of Lyndon LaRouche, to get a sense of the method. And then our weekly intelligence report, the Executive Intelligence Review Online, and then the daily report, the daily intelligence update that we make available. These are inexpensive, but they give people the benefit of the 50 years of our organization, which was shaped by the person who was the greatest genius of the last part of the last century, Lyndon LaRouche. And that's the way you deal with these cardboard cutouts who serve in the US Congress and who get their talking points from these think tanks, which are funded by the people who want war and want to continue this so-called unipolar order. So, I think start with us. That's the best place to go.
Okay, Mike Robinson, Harley Schlanger, I want to thank both of you for being with us today. I think we've supplied people with a comprehensive, shocking, and sometimes humorous report. And we would ask that everybody who's watched, and we want to thank you all for doing that, get active in the same sort of way and in the same spirit as those persons attending that congressional meeting in Michigan that we showed you at the beginning of today. That's it for the Manhattan Project for today, January 27th. We'll see you again next week.